The buzzards circled lazily against the pale October sky, their shadows dancing across the scorched earth like harbingers of death. Jakob McKenna pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes as he guided his sorrel mare, Rosie, through the maze of charred wagon wheels and scattered belongings that littered the prairie. The acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, 3 days after the attack that had left this wagon train nothing but ash and broken dreams. Jakob's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as he surveyed the devastation. He'd seen enough carnage during the war to last several lifetimes, but this scene still made his stomach clench. Torn calico dresses fluttered like prayer flags in the autumn wind, while children's toys lay broken and forgotten among the debris. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the scattered remains and the soft creak of his saddle leather. He'd ridden out from his ranch 20 miles south after hearing the distant gunfire 2 nights ago. By the time he'd arrived yesterday morning, there had been nothing left but smoke and silence. The cavalry had already come and gone, taking the bodies for burial and leaving the wreckage to the elements. Jakob had spent the day combing through the ruins, not from any morbid curiosity, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. Rosie snorted and shied away from an overturned water barrel, her ears pinned back in distress. Jakob patted her neck gently, understanding her unease. The mare had been with him through enough battlefields to recognize the smell of death, even when the bodies were gone. As they moved deeper into the devastation, Jakob's keen eyes caught sight of something that made him pull up short. There, beneath the twisted remains of a settler's wagon, a small piece of colored cloth fluttered weakly in the breeze. It was different from the other debris, newer, cleaner somehow. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered grain as he approached. The wagon had been overturned and partially burned, its contents spilled across a wide area. Jakob knelt beside it, his calloused hands carefully moving aside chunks of charred wood and twisted metal. The cloth was attached to something buried beneath the debris, something that made his heart stop cold. A tiny brown hand, no bigger than his thumb, emerged from the wreckage. Jakob's breath caught in his throat as he worked frantically but carefully to clear away the debris. His hand, steady enough to thread a needle or aim a rifle, trembled as he uncovered the small form. It was a baby, a Comanche infant, by the look of the beadwork on its tiny cradle board. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 months old, with delicate features and skin the color of burnished copper. For a moment, Jakob thought he was too late. The baby lay motionless, its tiny chest still, but as he gently lifted the child from its makeshift tomb, he felt the faintest flutter of breath against his palm. The infant's eyes fluttered open, dark as midnight, and filled with an ancient wisdom that seemed impossible in one so young. Jakob had never held a baby before. The tiny weight in his arms felt both fragile and precious, like holding a bird with a broken wing. The child looked up at him with those dark, solemn eyes, and Jakob felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct. He'd thought the war had burned out of him forever. The baby's lips were cracked and dry, its breathing shallow but steady. Jakob quickly uncorked his canteen and dipped his finger in the water, letting a few drops fall onto the child's parched lips. The infant's tongue darted out eagerly, and Jakob repeated the process, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Easy there, little one," he whispered, the first words he'd spoken aloud in months. His voice came out rough and rusty from disuse, but the sound seemed to calm the baby. "You're safe now." Jakob looked around at the devastation with new eyes. This hadn't been a random attack. It had been a rescue attempt. The Comanche had come for their own, probably after white settlers had taken this child in some earlier raid. The tragic irony wasn't lost on him. The very people who had come to save this baby had inadvertently buried it alive in their fierce battle with the wagon train defenders. The infant began to fuss, its tiny fists waving weakly in the air. Jakob knew he had to get the child to shelter and warmth quickly. The October nights were already turning cold, and the baby was severely dehydrated. He carefully wrapped the child in his coat, creating a makeshift bundle, and secured it inside his vest, where his body heat could warm the tiny form. As he prepared to mount Rosie, Jakob caught sight of something else in the debris, a small leather pouch that had been tied to the baby's cradle board. Inside were a few small trinkets, a piece of carved bone, some colorful beads, and what looked like a lock of black hair. These were the child's only connection to its past, its family, its people. Jakob tucked the pouch carefully into his saddlebag, then climbed onto Rosie with unusual care, mindful of the precious cargo nestled against his chest. The baby had grown quiet, its breathing steadying as Jakob's warmth surrounded it. For the first time in 3 years, Jakob McKenna felt something other than the hollow emptiness that had consumed him since the war ended. As they rode away from the devastation, Jakob's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Who would care for this child? What would happen when word got out that he'd found a Comanche baby? The town of Cedar Creek wasn't known for its tolerance, and Sheriff Wheeler had made his feelings about Indians crystal clear on more than one occasion. But as the tiny form stirred against his chest and small fingers grasped weakly at his shirt, Jakob realized that none of those concerns mattered right now. All that mattered was getting this child to safety, away from the buzzards and the bitter wind that carried the smell of death across the prairie. The sun was setting behind them as they rode toward his ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Jakob uncomfortably of flames. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new dangers, but tonight he would focus on keeping this small spark of life burning in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. The baby's breathing grew steady and deep against his chest, and Jakob found himself humming an old lullaby his mother had sung to him 30 years ago. The melody drifted across the empty prairie, carrying with it the promise that sometimes, even in the darkest places, life finds a way to survive. The first night nearly killed them both. Jakob's small ranch house had never felt so inadequate as it did with a crying baby in his arms and no earthly idea how to care for it. The child had awakened shortly after they'd arrived home, and its wails echoed off the rough-hewn walls like the cries of a lost soul. Jakob paced the cramped main room, bouncing the infant awkwardly, while his mind raced through everything he didn't know about babies. The fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the sparse furnishings: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with canned goods and ammunition. It was a bachelor's home, built for solitude and self-sufficiency, not for the needs of a helpless infant. Jakob had managed to get a few more drops of water into the baby during the ride home, but the child clearly needed more than he could provide. By dawn, desperation had driven him to hitch up his wagon and make the uncomfortable journey into Cedar Creek. The baby lay wrapped in his softest shirt, nestled in a wooden crate padded with old blankets, the best approximation of a cradle he could manage. The infant had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but Jakob could see the child was growing weaker. Cedar Creek squatted in the valley, like a collection of weathered bones bleaching in the sun. The main street was little more than a dirt track, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more substantial than they were. Jakob pulled his wagon up in front of Santos General Store, the only place in town where he might find what he needed without facing a barrage of questions he couldn't answer. Maria Santos looked up from her account books as the bell above her door chimed. At 35, she was a handsome woman with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. She'd inherited the store from her late husband and had learned to read people's needs as quickly as she could tally their bills. "Jakob McKenna," she said with genuine warmth, speaking in English despite her slight Mexican accent. "Haven't seen you in town for near 2 months. What brings you—" Her words died as she noticed the bundle in his arms. Jakob stood awkwardly in the doorway, the baby stirring fitfully in his arms. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, remembering with familiar frustration that the words he needed would never come. Instead, he carefully pulled back the blanket to reveal the infant's face. Maria's sharp intake of breath told him she understood immediately. Her eyes took in the child's distinctive features, the beadwork still visible on the tiny cradleboard, and the desperate situation written clearly on Jakob's weathered face. "Dios mío," she whispered, crossing herself quickly. "Where did you find this child?" Jakob set the baby gently on her counter and pulled out the small notebook he always carried. His handwriting was slow but legible. "Wagon train ruins. 3 days buried. Needs milk, medicine." Maria read the note twice, her expression growing more troubled with each word. "Jakob, do you understand what you've done? If anyone sees you with this baby—" He nodded grimly and wrote again. "Child was dying. Couldn't leave it." "Of course you couldn't," Maria said softly, her maternal instincts overriding her caution as she looked down at the infant. The baby's eyes had opened again, and it was looking around with that same solemn expression that had first captured Jakob's heart. "But what are you planning to do? You can't raise a baby alone, especially not—" She gestured helplessly at the child's obvious heritage. Jakob's jaw tightened as he wrote, "Don't know. Just need supplies now." Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. She'd known Jakob for 3 years, ever since he'd bought his small ranch and become a fixture at the edge of their community. He was an odd man, quiet to the point of being mute, keeping to himself, trading fairly but never lingering for conversation. Some folks thought him simple or touched by the war, but Maria had always sensed there was more to him than met the eye. "All right," she said finally, "but we need to be careful, very careful." For the next hour, Maria helped Jakob gather what they'd need: canned milk, sugar, a proper feeding bottle, soft cloths, and a supply of laudanum, for when the baby's crying might attract unwanted attention. She also insisted on giving him a small wooden cradle that had been gathering dust in her storage room. "My husband made this for our first child," she explained quietly. "The Lord never blessed us that way, but perhaps it can serve a purpose now." As they loaded the supplies into Jakob's wagon, Maria's expression grew increasingly worried. "Jakob, you need to think about this carefully. Sheriff Wheeler has been talking about the Indian troubles again. There are rumors that some of the ranchers want to organize another militia patrol. If they find out you're harboring a Comanche child—" Jakob paused in securing the cradle and looked at her directly. His blue eyes, usually distant and guarded, burned with a determination that surprised her. He pulled out his notebook again. "Right thing to do." "I know," Maria said. "I know it is. But sometimes doing the right thing can get you killed out here." The baby began to fuss again, and Maria instinctively reached for it. As she lifted the infant, her face softened with genuine affection. "What are you going to call this little one?" Jakob hesitated, then wrote, "Don't know. Had a name in Comanche." "Star?" Maria said suddenly, looking down at the baby. "There's a birthmark on her forehead, see? It looks like a little star." She paused, then added more quietly, "Pihua. That's the Comanche word for star. I learned some of their language when I was younger, before things got so bad between our peoples." Jakob nodded, something easing in his chest at having a name for the child. Little Star. It fit her somehow, this tiny being who had emerged from darkness into his carefully ordered world. As they prepared to leave, Maria caught his arm. "Jakob, I want to help. Bring her back in a few days, and I'll check on her health. And if you need someone to watch her when you have to work the ranch—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. The ride back to his ranch felt different with Little Star's new supplies secured in the wagon bed. The baby slept peacefully in the cradle, finally content after Maria had shown Jakob how to properly prepare and feed her the milk mixture. But as the familiar outline of his small house came into view, Jakob couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. That evening, as he sat by the fire with Little Star sleeping in her new cradle beside him, Jakob stared into the flames and tried to think through his situation logically. He was a single man with no experience caring for children, trying to raise a Comanche baby in the middle of territory where such an act could be seen as treasonous. He had no legal claim to the child, no way to protect her if the authorities decided to intervene, and no idea if her own people were still searching for her. But as Little Star stirred in her sleep and made a small, contented sound, Jakob realized that logic had nothing to do with his decision. This child had been placed in his path for a reason, and he would protect her with his life if necessary. The war had taken so much from him: his voice, his peace, his faith in humanity. Perhaps caring for this innocent life was his chance at redemption. Outside, the October wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of winter and the distant sound of wolves calling to each other in the darkness. Jakob pulled his chair closer to the cradle and settled in for another sleepless night, his hand resting gently on the cradle's edge, ready to comfort Little Star if she awakened. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, and new questions about what he was doing and why. But tonight, in the warm circle of firelight with the baby sleeping peacefully beside him, Jakob McKenna felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war: purpose. 2 weeks had passed since Jakob found Little Star, and the first hard frost of the season painted the prairie grass silver in the early morning light. The baby had grown stronger under his careful attention, her cheeks filling out and her dark eyes growing bright with curiosity. She had begun to smile, a toothless grin that never failed to warm Jakob's heart, and had started making small cooing sounds that he found himself answering with his own gentle murmurs. But peace was an illusion on the frontier, and Jakob's carefully constructed solitude was about to shatter. 30 miles north, Red Hawk knelt beside the cold ashes of what had once been his daughter's cooking fire. The Comanche war chief's weathered face was set in lines of granite as he sifted through the charred remains of his family's lodge. 3 weeks had passed since the cavalry raid that had scattered his band and stolen his world, but the ashes still held the bitter taste of smoke and sorrow. His daughter Morningbird was dead, that much he knew. He had found her body among the others after the soldiers left, and had sung her spirit to the next world with tears streaming down his painted cheeks. But her child, his granddaughter Little Star, remained missing. The soldiers had taken several children with them to the reservation, but when Red Hawk had risked everything to scout the military compound, the baby was not among them. "Grandfather," said Whitehorse, Red Hawk's nephew, approaching on silent feet. The young warrior's face was grim with frustration. The tracks lead to the big river, then vanish. The cavalry split into 3 groups after the raid. We cannot follow them all. Red Hawk stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 57, he was no longer the swift young warrior who had counted coup against Mexican soldiers in his youth, but his mind remained sharp as a steel blade. "Tell me again what the traders said." Whitehorse glanced around nervously before speaking. Even meeting with the Mexican traders, who sometimes brought news from the settlements, was dangerous now, with patrols scouring the territory for any sign of Comanche presence. "They spoke of a wagon train attacked 3 days after our village was raided," Whitehorse said. "White settlers heading west. All killed, they said, but the goods scattered and burned. Some blamed our people for the attack, but we were fleeing south," Red Hawk mused, "running from the cavalry. We had no warriors to spare for raids." His eyes sharpened. "Unless—" "What are you thinking, grandfather?" Red Hawk was quiet for a long moment, staring at the horizon where heat waves shimmered like spirits dancing. "What if some of our people did attack that wagon train? What if they were searching for Little Star, believing the whites had taken her?" The possibility hit Whitehorse like a physical blow. "You think the baby was with the wagon train? I think we must know for certain." Red Hawk turned to face his nephew, and Whitehorse saw the desperate hope burning in the older man's eyes. "Gather Long Wolf and Running Bear. We ride to the place where this wagon train died." Meanwhile, in Cedar Creek, Jacob's secret was becoming increasingly difficult to keep. Sheriff Tom Wheeler, a thick-bodied man with suspicious eyes and a perpetual scowl, had been asking questions around town. Someone had mentioned seeing Jacob's wagon outside the general store, loaded with unusual supplies, and Wheeler's curiosity was aroused. "Maria Santos is too soft on that mute," Wheeler confided to his deputy, a nervous young man named Billy Hodges. "Always has been. Man like that living alone, keeping to himself, there's something not right about it." "What do you think he's hiding, Sheriff?" Billy asked, genuinely curious. "Don't know yet," Wheeler replied, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "But I aim to find out. A man doesn't buy baby supplies unless he's got a baby, and last I checked, Jakob McKenna wasn't married." That afternoon, Wheeler decided to pay Jacob a visit under the pretense of checking on his isolated ranch's security. The ride out gave him time to think about what he might find. The Indian troubles had everyone on edge, and Wheeler prided himself on being vigilant against any threat to his community. Jakob was splitting wood behind his house when he saw the dust cloud approaching. His stomach clenched as he recognized Wheeler's distinctive sorrel gelding and the badge glinting on the rider's vest. Little Star was napping inside the house, and Jacob prayed she would remain quiet during the sheriff's visit. "Afternoon, McKenna," Wheeler called out as he dismounted. His eyes were already scanning the property, looking for anything unusual. "Just checking on folks out this way. Heard there might be Indian sign in the area." Jakob nodded and gestured toward the house, offering the traditional frontier hospitality of coffee. But Wheeler waved him off, continuing his visual inspection of the yard. "You been seeing anything suspicious lately? Smoke signals, tracks, anything like that?" Jakob shook his head, his hands clenched around the axe handle. Wheeler's gaze lingered on the woodpile, the barn, and finally the house itself. "Mind if I water my horse?" Wheeler asked, but he was already leading his mount toward the well. The path took him directly past the house's single window, and Jacob's heart hammered as he realized the sheriff would be able to see inside. Just as Wheeler approached the window, Little Star's cry pierced the afternoon air, a healthy, demanding wail that could belong to only one thing, a baby. Wheeler's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. "That a baby crying, McKenna?" Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't deny what they'd both clearly heard, but he also couldn't explain without revealing Little Star's heritage. He managed a weak nod, his face flushing with the effort of trying to appear casual. "Well, I'll be damned," Wheeler said, his suspicion deepening. "When did you get married? And to who? I don't recall seeing any woman around these parts who'd take up with a mute." Before Jakob could figure out how to respond, Wheeler was striding toward the house. "Let me congratulate the new parents," he said with false joviality, but his hand rested on his gun butt. Jakob stepped quickly to block his path, shaking his head frantically. But Wheeler was not a man to be deterred when his curiosity was aroused. "Now see here, McKenna," Wheeler said, his voice hardening. "You're acting mighty strange about a simple baby. Makes a man wonder what you might be hiding." The standoff might have lasted longer, if not for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both men turned to see Maria Santos riding up on her bay mare, a basket secured to her saddle. "Sheriff Wheeler," she called out pleasantly as she dismounted. "What brings you out to Jacob's place?" "Just checking on things," Wheeler replied, but his stance remained aggressive. "Seems our friend here has acquired himself a baby, but he's being mighty secretive about it." Maria's face remained perfectly composed as she approached them. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive wave. "Jakob's been helping me care for my cousin's child while she recovers from a difficult birth. The baby's been fussy, so I asked him to keep little Anna here where it's quieter." It was a masterful lie, delivered with such casual confidence that even Jakob almost believed it. Wheeler's suspicion flickered, but didn't entirely fade. "Your cousin?" he pressed. "Don't recall hearing about any cousin having a baby." "She lives down near San Antonio," Maria replied smoothly. "Married a rancher down that way. Poor thing had a terrible time of it, and the doctor said she needed complete rest." Jakob kindly offered to help. Inside the house, little Star's cries were growing more insistent. Maria glanced toward the sound with practiced maternal concern. "I should tend to her," she said to Jakob. "You know how cranky she gets when she's hungry." As Maria headed for the house, Wheeler called after her. "I'd like to see this baby if you don't mind, just to congratulate the new mother, you understand." Maria paused at the door, her hand on the latch. For a heartbeat, Jakob thought their deception was about to crumble, but Maria turned back with a knowing smile. "Of course, Sheriff, though I should warn you, she's got her father's lungs and her mother's temper, quite the little wildcat when she's upset." The warning was perfectly calculated. Wheeler, like most frontier bachelors, had a healthy fear of crying babies and female mysteries. He waved them off with obvious relief. "Maybe another time," he said gruffly, "when she's in a better mood." As Wheeler mounted his horse and rode away, Jakob felt his knees go weak with relief. But Maria's expression remained troubled as she watched the sheriff disappear into the distance. "This can't continue much longer," she said quietly. "Wheeler's suspicious and he's not the type to let things go. Plus, there are rumors in town about Comanche war parties in the area. People are getting scared." Inside the house, little Star's cries had grown to a wail that seemed to echo across the empty prairie. As Maria went to tend to her, Jakob stared at the horizon and wondered how much longer he could keep his secret safe. Unknown to him, Red Hawk and his warriors were only a day's ride away, following the cold trail of the destroyed wagon train toward answers that would change everything. The morning of the confrontation dawned cold and clear, with frost glittering on the prairie grass like scattered diamonds. Jakob was feeding little Star her morning bottle when Rosie's nervous whinny from the corral sent ice through his veins. The mare only made that sound when strangers approached, and in this territory, strangers often meant trouble. Jakob set the baby gently in her cradle and moved to the window, careful to stay back from the glass. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their painted ponies at the edge of his property, perhaps 200 yards away. They were studying his ranch with the patience of hunters evaluating prey. Even at this distance, Jakob could see they were no ordinary raiding party. These men carried themselves with the dignity of seasoned warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons held with casual confidence. The leader, a man of perhaps 50 with silver streaking his black hair, wore a magnificent war bonnet that marked him as a chief. Jakob's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but something in the warrior's posture stopped him. They weren't approaching aggressively or trying to surround the house. They simply sat and watched as if waiting for something. Behind him, little Star began to fuss, her small cries cutting through the morning stillness. Jakob turned to comfort her, and when he looked back out the window, his heart nearly stopped. The warriors had heard the baby's cry. The chief was leaning forward on his horse, his head tilted as if listening intently. Red Hawk's weathered face was a mask of stone as he studied the white man's dwelling, but inside his chest, hope and fear warred like opposing armies. The cry he'd heard was that of an infant, and in his grandfather's heart, he knew it was little Star. But the knowledge that his granddaughter was in the hands of a white man filled him with a rage that threatened to consume his judgment. "Grandfather," White Horse whispered, his voice tight with tension. "What do we do?" Red Hawk raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving the house. After 3 weeks of searching, following cold trails and chasing rumors, he had found what he sought. But the situation was far more complex than he had imagined. This was no military compound or settlement where they could strike hard and fast. This was a single man's home, isolated and vulnerable, and somewhere inside was the child he had crossed half of Texas to find. "We wait," Red Hawk said finally. "Let the white man show himself. If he has harmed Little Star—" He didn't need to finish the threat. His companions understood perfectly. Inside the house, Jakob's mind raced through his limited options. He could try to fight, but 3 skilled warriors would overwhelm him quickly. He could try to flee, but they would easily run down his wagon on the open prairie. The only option left was the one that terrified him most. He would have to try to communicate with them. Jakob picked up Little Star, her small weight both a comfort and a burden in his arms. She had quieted, looking up at him with those dark, solemn eyes that seemed to understand far more than any baby should. He thought of the small leather pouch he'd found with her, the one containing her few personal belongings. Perhaps those items would help him explain. With his heart hammering against his ribs, Jakob opened the door and stepped onto his porch. The effect on the warriors was immediate and dramatic. The chief's back straightened and his hand moved to his weapon. The other 2 warriors shifted position, ready to charge at their leader's command. Jakob held up his empty hand in the universal gesture of peace, then slowly pulled Little Star's blanket back to reveal her face. The sound that came from the chief was barely human, a low moan of recognition and pain that spoke of loss and desperate hope. "Piwa," Red Hawk breathed, using the Comanche name for his granddaughter. "Little Star." The chief dismounted in one fluid motion, his feet hitting the ground with barely a sound. His companions flanked him, their weapons ready but not yet raised. The 3 men began walking toward the house with the measured pace of hunters approaching dangerous prey. Jakob fought every instinct screaming at him to retreat into the house. Instead, he stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the warriors, Little Star secure in his arms. When they were perhaps 30 feet apart, he stopped and carefully knelt, placing the baby on the ground between them. The gesture was unmistakable. He was offering to return the child. Red Hawk's eyes never left his granddaughter as she lay on the blanket, her tiny fists waving in the cool morning air. She was alive, healthy, and clearly well cared for. The white man had not harmed her. Indeed, he had obviously gone to great lengths to keep her safe and fed. But the sight of his granddaughter in this strange place, surrounded by the alien world of the whites, filled Red Hawk with a complex mixture of relief and rage. This man had taken something precious from his world, even if he had also saved her life. "You," Red Hawk said in broken English, his voice heavy with emotion. "You have my blood, my daughter's child." Jakob nodded slowly, then rose and walked back to the house. The warriors tensed, but he returned moments later with the small leather pouch he'd found with Little Star. He held it out to Red Hawk, who took it with trembling hands. Inside were the items Red Hawk remembered, the carved bone his daughter had made, the beads from her first woman's dress, and a lock of hair from his beloved wife, dead these 10 years. These simple objects confirmed what his heart already knew. This was indeed his granddaughter, and somehow this white man had found her. "Where?" Red Hawk demanded, his English limited but his meaning clear. "Where did you find her?" Jakob wished desperately that he could speak, that he could explain what had happened and how he'd come to find Little Star buried in the wagon train wreckage. Instead, he pulled out his small notebook and began to write, his hands shaking with tension. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. Found her buried alive in wagon train ruins. 3 days under debris. Was dying. Saved her. Red Hawk took the notebook and studied the words, his lips moving silently as he worked through the English. When understanding dawned, his face went through a series of emotions. Surprise, relief, and something that might have been gratitude. "You save her?" he asked, his voice softer now. Jakob nodded, then wrote again, "Couldn't leave child to die. Fed her, cared for her, kept her safe." Whitehorse, who had been silently watching this exchange, suddenly spoke in rapid Comanche. Red Hawk's expression darkened as he listened, and Jakob felt his heart sink. Whatever the younger warrior was saying, it wasn't good. "My nephew says you are thief," Red Hawk said finally. "Says you steal Comanche child, try to make her white." Jakob shook his head frantically and wrote, "No, only wanted to save her. Didn't know who she belonged to." "But you know now." Red Hawk said, his voice growing harder. You know she is mine, my blood, my daughter's child. The moment stretched between them like a bowstring drawn taut. Jakob looked down at Little Star, who was looking up at him with those dark eyes that had become so familiar. She made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a soft call that seemed directed at him. Red Hawk noticed the baby's response to the white man, and something in his expression shifted. She knows you, he said wonderingly. She calls to you. Jakob nodded, tears threatening to blur his vision. In the 3 weeks since he'd found her, Little Star had become the center of his world. The thought of losing her felt like losing a piece of his soul, but he also understood what honor demanded. This was not his child, not his blood, not his world. She belonged with her people, with her grandfather who had searched for her with such desperate determination. Jakob knelt again and gently lifted Little Star from the blanket. He held her close for one final moment, memorizing the weight of her in his arms, the sound of her breathing, the way she curled her tiny fist around his finger. Then, with the hardest decision of his life, he walked forward and placed her in Red Hawk's waiting arms. The old chief's face crumpled as he held his granddaughter for the first time in weeks. She looked up at him with curious eyes, then made a small sound that might have been recognition. Red Hawk spoke to her in Comanche, his voice thick with emotion, and she seemed to respond to the familiar sounds. You have given me back my heart, Red Hawk said to Jakob, his English careful but sincere. You could have kept her, raised her white, but you give her back to her people. This is a good thing. Jakob nodded, unable to trust his voice, even if he could have spoken. He watched as Red Hawk studied his granddaughter, checking her over with the careful attention of a man who had feared the worst. She is well, Red Hawk said finally. Strong. You have cared for her like she was your own. The compliment meant more to Jakob than any words ever had. He had done right by Little Star, even if it broke his heart to let her go. But as Red Hawk prepared to mount his horse with the baby, Jakob realized the confrontation was far from over. In the distance, a dust cloud was approaching fast, multiple riders moving at speed toward his ranch. Even from this distance, he could see the glint of metal badges and the distinctive formation of a posse. Sheriff Wheeler had finally decided to get his answers, and he was bringing help. The approaching dust cloud meant death for someone. Jakob could see it in the way Red Hawk's warriors immediately shifted into defensive positions, their rifles appearing in their hands with practiced ease. Sheriff Wheeler's posse was still a mile away, but closing fast, and Jakob found himself caught between two forces that had been at war for generations. Soldiers? Red Hawk asked, his voice sharp with alarm as he cradled Little Star protectively against his chest. Jakob shook his head and scribbled quickly in his notebook, Sheriff and posse. They don't know about baby. If they see you here... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Red Hawk understood perfectly. The arrival of a sheriff's posse, while Comanche warriors were on his property, would be seen as evidence of the worst kind of collaboration. Jakob would be branded a traitor, and the warriors would face a running battle across open ground, with a baby in their arms. We go, Red Hawk said immediately, but White Horse grabbed his arm. Uncle, the horses are tired from 3 days hard riding. The white men's mounts are fresh. They will catch us on the open prairie. Red Hawk's weathered face showed the agony of his dilemma. He had his granddaughter back, but escaping with her seemed impossible. The posse would be armed with rifles and would show no mercy to Comanche warriors, especially ones found so close to a white settlement. Jakob looked from the approaching riders to Red Hawk holding Little Star, and in that moment, he made the most important decision of his life. He grabbed Red Hawk's arm and pointed toward his barn, then began writing frantically. Hide in barn loft. I'll tell them I've seen nothing. When dark, you can escape. Red Hawk stared at him with obvious suspicion. Why? Why would you help us? Your own people come. Jakob met the chief's gaze steadily and wrote one word. Honor. The simple response seemed to resonate with Red Hawk more than any elaborate explanation could have. In his world, honor was everything, worth more than life itself. That this white man understood that concept and was willing to risk everything for it spoke to something deep in the old warrior's heart. Come, Jakob said aloud, his rusty voice barely above a whisper. He led the 3 warriors quickly toward the barn, Little Star quiet in her grandfather's arms, as if she understood the danger. The barn was dim and filled with the familiar scents of hay and horses. Jakob pointed to the ladder leading to the loft, then grabbed armfuls of loose hay to help conceal any sign of their presence. As Red Hawk climbed carefully with the baby, Jakob caught his arm one final time. If something happens to me, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, take care of her. Red Hawk nodded gravely. You have my word, white man, and you have something else. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small eagle feather, pressing it into Jakob's palm. This marks you as friend to the Comanche. Any of our people who see this will know you are under our protection. Jakob closed his fingers around the feather, feeling its significance like a weight in his chest. Then he hurried from the barn, brushing hay from his clothes and trying to compose himself for what was coming. Sheriff Wheeler arrived with 6 men, all armed, and all wearing the grim expressions of men expecting trouble. Jakob recognized most of them. Billy Hodges, the nervous deputy, Tom Morrison, who owned the largest ranch in the county, and several other townsmen whose faces reflected the fear and prejudice that had been building for weeks. "McKenna!" Wheeler called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk." Jakob nodded and walked toward them, trying to project calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, he could almost feel the presence of the hidden warriors, and he prayed that Little Star would remain quiet. "We've had reports of Indian sign in this area," Wheeler continued, his suspicious eyes scanning the property. "Tracks leading this way. You seen anything unusual?" Jakob shook his head, then pulled out his notebook. "Been working all morning. Seen nothing." "That so?" Wheeler's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "Mind if we look around? Just to be safe, you understand?" Before Jakob could respond, Tom Morrison spoke up. "Sheriff, look here." He was pointing at the ground near the barn, where the warriors' horses had left clear tracks in the soft earth. Wheeler's face darkened as he studied the prints. "Those are Indian ponies, sure enough. Unshod horses, distinctive hoof patterns." He looked up at Jakob with undisguised hostility. "You want to explain these, McKenna?" Jacob's mouth went dry. He could lie, claim the tracks were old, but the prints were clearly fresh. Instead, he wrote carefully, "Don't know. Maybe they stopped for water and moved on." "Maybe," Wheeler said, but his tone suggested he thought otherwise. "Boys, spread out. Check the barn, the house, everywhere. If there are hostiles around, we need to know." As the men began to move toward the barn, Jakob stepped directly into Wheeler's path. The sheriff's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You seem mighty eager to keep us from searching your property, McKenna. Makes a man wonder what you might be hiding." Jakob forced himself to remain calm and wrote, "Just don't want my property torn apart for nothing." "Nothing?" Wheeler repeated. 3 families have been killed by Comanche raids in the past month. If there are war parties in this area, that's not nothing. From inside the barn came the sound of men moving around, searching through the stalls and equipment. Jakob's heart sank as he realized they would inevitably check the loft. There was no way to hide 3 grown warriors and a baby in such a small space. But then a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Sheriff Wheeler, what brings you out this way?" Everyone turned to see Maria Santos riding up on her bay mare, her face showing just the right amount of curious concern. She was alone, but her presence seemed to change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Miss Santos," Wheeler said, tipping his hat but not relaxing his guard, "we're tracking Indian sign, seems to lead right to McKenna's property." "Indians?" Maria's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine alarm. "How frightening! But surely you don't suspect Jakob of any wrongdoing. He's been nothing but a good neighbor since he arrived." "That remains to be seen," Wheeler replied grimly. "We're conducting a thorough search." From the barn came Billy Hodges' voice. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Jacob's blood turned to ice as Wheeler strode toward the barn, the other men following. Inside, Billy was standing at the base of the ladder to the loft, holding up a strand of black horsehair that had caught on one of the rungs. "This is from an Indian pony," Billy said excitedly. "Fresh, too. They've been up in that loft." Wheeler's face was murderous as he turned back to Jakob. "Last chance, McKenna." "Where are they?" Jakob opened his mouth, then closed it again, his silence speaking volumes. Wheeler drew his pistol, and several of the other men followed suit. "Billy, get up in that loft," Wheeler ordered. "The rest of you, surround the barn. Nobody gets out." As Billy started up the ladder, Jakob made his decision. He couldn't let innocent people die because of his choices. He grabbed Wheeler's arm and shook his head frantically, then began writing in his notebook. But before he could finish, Little Star's cry echoed from the loft above, a healthy, demanding wail that froze every man in place. "Sweet Jesus," Tom Morrison breathed. "That's a baby." Wheeler's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, realization, and then a rage that made his previous anger seem mild. "You've been harboring Indians," he snarled at Jakob. "In time of war, that makes you a traitor." "Wait," Maria said quickly. stepping between Jakob and the sheriff. Let me explain. The baby isn't... Her words were cut off as Red Hawk appeared at the top of the ladder, Little Star in his arms, his dignity intact despite his desperate situation. White Horse and Running Bear flanked him, their weapons ready but not raised. We surrender, Red Hawk said clearly in English. No fight. We only came for the child. The silence that followed was deafening. Wheeler's pistol was aimed directly at Red Hawk's chest, and Jakob could see the sheriff's finger tightening on the trigger. The child is mine, Red Hawk continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. My blood, my daughter's baby. This man, he gestured toward Jakob, found her dying and saved her life. He is not traitor. He is friend. Wheeler's face showed his struggle to process this information. You're saying McKenna found your baby, and instead of turning it over to the authorities, he kept it? He kept her alive, Red Hawk said simply, cared for her like his own child. Then, when we came, he gave her back freely. This is honorable, man. Jakob watched Wheeler's face, seeing the war between prejudice and pragmatism playing out behind his eyes. The sheriff was faced with a situation that didn't fit his simple worldview. A white man who had risked everything to save an Indian baby, and Indians who spoke of honor and friendship rather than violence. That may be, Wheeler said finally, but the law is the law. These are hostile Indians in our territory. I have to arrest them. No, Maria said firmly, stepping forward. You don't. Wheeler's head snapped toward her. What did you say? I said no. Maria's voice was steady, but Jakob could see the determination burning in her dark eyes. These people came here in peace, seeking their own child. They found that child safe and well cared for. They're not raiding, not attacking, not threatening anyone. They're just family. Family or not, they're still human beings, Maria interrupted, with the same rights as any parent to their own child. The standoff stretched taut as a wire, with every man's finger on his trigger, and the lives of everyone present hanging in the balance. Jakob realized that this moment would define not just his future, but the future of everyone he'd come to care about. Slowly, deliberately, Jakob walked over to stand beside Red Hawk. He looked up at the Comanche chief and nodded once, then turned to face Wheeler with his chin raised in defiance. The message was clear. If Wheeler wanted to arrest the Indians, he'd have to go through Jakob first. One by one, to Jakob's amazement, the other men began to lower their weapons. Tom Morrison was first, shaking his head with a rueful smile. Damn it, Wheeler. The man saved a baby. How do you arrest someone for that? Billy Hodges holstered his pistol next, followed by the others. Even Wheeler, faced with the united opposition of his own posse, finally let his gun arm drop. This is highly irregular, he muttered, but the fight had gone out of him. Red Hawk climbed down from the loft with careful dignity, Little Star quiet in his arms. When he reached the ground, he walked directly to Jakob and spoke in clear, carrying voice that every man could hear. You are brave man, he said. Good man. You saved my granddaughter when you could have let her die. You care for her when you could have turned her away. You protect her when you could have betrayed her. He paused, then continued with formal gravity. Red Hawk, chief of the Comanche, names you friend and brother. You will always be welcome in our lodges, and any who harm you answer to me. The words carried the weight of a sacred oath, and even Wheeler seemed to understand their significance. Jakob felt tears threatening as he looked down at Little Star one final time, memorizing her face. Goodbye, Little Star, he whispered. As the Comanche warriors prepared to leave, Red Hawk turned back to Wheeler. We go in peace, he said. We take only what is ours, our child, and our memories of a good man who showed us that not all whites are enemies. Wheeler nodded curtly, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, but unable to find legal grounds to intervene. As the warriors mounted their horses, Little Star secure in her grandfather's arms, Jakob felt a piece of his heart breaking away. But as he watched them ride toward the horizon, he also felt something else. Peace. He had done the right thing, regardless of the cost. Little Star would grow up knowing her heritage, her culture, her people, and somewhere in her memories would be the knowledge that she had once been loved by a silent cowboy who risked everything to keep her safe. Maria moved to stand beside him as the riders disappeared into the distance. You did the right thing, she said softly. Jakob nodded, then pulled out his notebook one final time. She's where she belongs. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jakob McKenna stood on his porch and felt the weight of solitude settle around him once again. But this time it was different. This time he carried with him the knowledge that he had made a difference in the world, that he had chosen love over fear, honor over safety, and hope over despair. In his pocket, the eagle feather Red Hawk had given him seemed to pulse with warmth, a reminder that some bonds transcend the artificial divisions of race and culture. Jakob smiled for the first time in years and walked into his house, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring.